A thin veil of dust hung in the air as the afternoon train pulled into the quiet station of Willow Ridge. From the last carriage, a young woman stepped down, Elena Carter, her eyes bright with hope, her gloved hands clutching a modest bouquet she had bought for herself, a fragile symbol of new beginnings. She had crossed half the country for this moment, 6 months of tender letters, 3 long weeks of travel, and a lifetime of dreams carried in one suitcase. But before she could even speak, she met the eyes of the man she came to marry, Thomas Green, a widowed merchant who had sworn he was ready for love again. His face turned pale, his lips trembling as he stammered, You didn't mention you were black." His voice cracked through the warm air like a whip. The flowers in her hands suddenly felt heavy. The world around her seemed to pause, the whispers, the gasps, the weight of 100 stares pressing down on her. In that single moment, everything she had built in her mind, the home, the warmth, the acceptance, all turned to dust. Elena stood still, her small hat trembling in the wind, her dignity fighting to hold its ground, while her heart shattered quietly beneath the surface. Thomas took a step back, his eyes darting nervously, as if proximity alone could taint his reputation. And just like that, months of shared promises became nothing more than empty words, blown away by a single truth, the color of her skin. There are moments in life that carve themselves into our souls, moments when the world reveals its cruelty and asks, "What will you do now?" Some break under it, some run, but a rare few rise from that rejection and rewrite the very story meant to destroy them. That day at the Willow Ridge station, Elena Carter was not just humiliated, she was reborn. The woman the town pitied would soon hold the truth that could bring every proud man in Willow Ridge to his knees. If you believe that people should be judged by their hearts and not by the color of their skin, take a moment now, hit that subscribe button and join us. Because this inspiring black story of justice and redemption will remind you that every act of cruelty can awaken a force far greater than hate. So don't look away. What begins as a story of rejection will soon become a battle for dignity, equality, and the power of truth. Stay with us, because by the end of this journey, you'll understand how one woman's courage can turn shame into legacy and prejudice into a lesson the world will never forget. The silence that followed Thomas's words was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, carrying with it the scent of iron and shame. Around them, the small station of Willow Ridge froze in morbid curiosity. Every eye turned, every whisper sliced through the air like a blade. The murmurs grew louder, feeding on humiliation, as though cruelty were a form of entertainment. Thomas shifted uneasily, his nervous laugh cracking through the stillness. He couldn't look her in the eye. "Listen," he began, fumbling with his pocket, his voice dripping with false politeness. This is not what I expected. You should have said something. I can help you get back. I'll pay for your return." He pulled out a handful of bills, his hand shaking not from generosity, but from fear of being seen beside her. For a moment, Elena didn't move. The world around her blurred a swirl of muted faces, eyes filled with judgment, disgust, pity. She looked down at the crumpled money in his palm, the same hand that had written her tender words about destiny and devotion. Was this the price of her worth? Was this what love cost when the world saw only skin? Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she lifted her chin. "You can't buy your way out of shame, Mr. Green. Not mine, and not yours." The crowd shifted, uneasy. The men looked away, the women clutched their handbags tighter. Thomas's lips twisted into a forced smile, the corners of his mouth shaking. "You don't understand. People here, they talk, they judge. I have a business, a reputation, and I have dignity," Elena interrupted, her tone quiet but sharp enough to cut through his excuses. "Is that something you can pay for too?" The wind rose suddenly, tugging at her small hat, spinning it off into the air. Her hair, dark as midnight, caught the sunlight, glimmering like silk. Her tears did not fall. They glistened behind her eyes, refusing to give the crowd what it came for. A soft, bitter smile curved her lips, not of surrender, but of realization. There was no home for her in this man's cowardice. In that moment, she understood that love built on illusion was never love at all. Thomas looked around, desperate to escape the gaze of the bystanders. "Please?" he muttered, thrusting the bills toward her again, as though throwing money could erase the color of her skin. "Take it. Just go." Elena took a step back, her voice calm, deliberate, almost tender. "You asked me to be honest with you, Thomas. I sent you my truth in every letter. You just never asked what shade it came in. His hand dropped, the bills fluttering to the ground like fallen leaves. The station master coughed, the crowd began to disperse, but the damage was already carved into memory. Elena straightened her shoulders, gathering what little was left of her composure. The sunlight broke through a passing cloud, spilling across her face, soft, resolute, unbroken. And though her heart was splintering inside her chest, she walked away without another word, her steps steady, her back unbowed. In that cruel stillness, a truth echoed louder than any insult. When self-respect is buried under the weight of shame, dignity becomes the final pair of wings that can still make a soul fly. A voice rose from behind the crowd, calm yet commanding, cutting through the tension like a strike of thunder on a still afternoon. Is that your solution, Mr. Green? Throw money at your shame and hope it buys back your conscience? The crowd turned as one. From the edge of the platform, a tall man stepped forward, broad-shouldered, sun-kissed skin marked by a life spent outdoors, but dressed with the effortless refinement that only true wealth affords. His boots struck the wooden planks with slow precision, each step echoing authority. Thomas stiffened, the color drained from his face as he recognized the newcomer. "Mr. Hawthorne!" His voice faltered. This isn't your concern." William Hawthorne paused, his eyes fixed on Thomas' eyes that carried both warmth and warning, a rare balance forged from integrity and command. "It becomes my concern when I see a man I've known for 15 years behave like a coward in broad daylight." The murmurs swelled again, but now they carried a different tone, surprise, curiosity, even respect. For in Willow Ridge, there was one name whispered with equal parts awe and envy. William Hawthorne, the man who owned nearly half the valley, whose land fed the town and whose word carried more weight than the mayor's. He turned to Elena then, and for a fleeting moment, the sharpness in his gaze softened. There was no pity there, only recognition, the kind that passes silently between those who know what it means to stand alone. "Miss," he said, his voice lowering into something steady and sincere, "no one should be humiliated simply for existing. Not here. Not anywhere." Elena held his gaze, wary yet drawn to the quiet certainty in his tone. Around them, whispers rippled like wind through tall grass. Thomas stammered, his hand still trembling with the useless bills. "You don't understand, Hawthorne. The people here, they won't. They'll do what they've always done," William interrupted, his voice unyielding. "Talk, judge, hide behind their fears. But you, Thomas, you've built your business on my land. Every crate you sell, every wagon that bears your name, crosses soil I own. So if you think your reputation is fragile, imagine what becomes of it when you prove yourself smaller than the world already suspects." A hush fell. Thomas's throat worked soundlessly as the meaning sank in. He looked smaller now, swallowed by his own cowardice. William took a step closer, lowering his tone until it was meant only for the trembling merchant. "You had the chance to be better. You wrote her letters. You claimed to seek kindness, intelligence, companionship. And now that she stands before you, all you see is color? That says more about your blindness than hers." Thomas's eyes darted desperately toward the bystanders, searching for support that wasn't there. The same mouths that had once whispered in his favor now stayed shut, watching with thinly veiled judgment. William straightened, turning once more to Elena. "Forgive the spectacle, Miss Carter. Willow Ridge is a small place, small in heart, smaller still in vision. But my home sits on the hill beyond the river. You'll find it quieter there. If you'll allow it, I can offer you a place to rest until you decide your next step." The offer hung in the air, heavy with both kindness and consequence. Elena hesitated. Kindness, she had learned, was often a mask for another kind of cruelty. Yet there was something different in his tone, not charity, but respect. Thomas's voice cracked with disbelief. "You can't be serious, Hawthorne. What will people say?" William smiled faintly, but it was not a smile of humor. It was cold, deliberate. "They'll say what they always do, but they'll still plow my fields, trade on my terms, and rely on my harvests. Let them talk." Thomas's composure finally broke. His lips quivered, his hands clenched uselessly at his sides. He was a man unmasked, small, pale, and afraid. For the first time since she stepped off the train, Elena felt something stir within her, not safety, not yet, but the faint spark of being seen, not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as a person. She gathered the fallen flowers from the ground, their petals bruised but not broken. And when she looked up, William Hawthorne was still standing there, a man of the sun and the soil, a stranger who spoke not in promises, but in truth. In a town where silence had always favored the strong, his voice had become a shield. And for the first time that day, Elena Carter no longer felt alone. The carriage rolled slowly through the winding road that led to the Hawthorne estate. Evening light spilled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet. Through the open window, Elena caught glimpses of endless fields, rows of golden wheat swaying gently in the wind, horses grazing beyond the fences, and the distant outline of a grand house rising from the heart of the valley like a promise. As they approached, tall iron gates came into view, ornate yet unpretentious. The metal gleamed softly under the fading sun, flanked by towering willows that whispered against the breeze. Beyond them, a long driveway stretched toward a stately white manor, its wooden beams weathered by time, but still standing with quiet dignity. For the first time in days, the air around her felt different. Not welcoming, perhaps, but patient, as though the land itself was willing to wait before passing judgment. When the carriage stopped, William stepped out first, offering a hand without hesitation. "Welcome to Hawthorne Hall," he said simply. His tone carried neither pride nor pity, only calm assurance. At the door, a woman in her 50s stood waiting. Neat bun, crisp apron, eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Collins," William introduced. "She keeps this place running better than I ever could." "Mrs.?" Collins gave a small nod, her gaze meeting Elena's with professional courtesy. "Good evening, Miss Carter. Your room has been prepared, the blue room, sir," she added, turning slightly toward William. "The one with the garden view," he confirmed. Elena hesitated, uncertain of her place in this quiet order, but Mrs. Collins gestured gently. "Come, dear, you must be tired." The house unfolded around her in whispers of old wood and fading portraits. Chandeliers hung above dark oak floors. Bookshelves lined the walls like silent witnesses of time. Every room carried the faint scent of lemon oil and history. When they reached the blue room, Elena paused at the threshold. Pale curtains framed the window, swaying softly in the evening air. The walls, washed in a calm hue of powder blue, reflected the fading daylight like water. There was a writing desk, a vase of fresh lilies, and a quilt folded neatly across the bed. It was more than comfort, it was dignity restored. "Dinner will be served at 7, Mrs. Collins said. "The master insists on proper meals, even when he forgets to eat." There was a faint smile before she left, the door closing softly behind her. Elena stood still, letting her gaze travel across the room. She had not been offered kindness like this in a long time, but experience had taught her that kindness could be fragile, a warmth that cooled the moment one overstayed their welcome. She placed her worn gloves on the desk and whispered to herself, one night at a time. That evening, the dining room was lit by candles and quiet. Through the tall windows, fireflies drifted across the garden. William sat at the head of the table, his posture straight yet unassuming. "I was raised to believe," he began after a moment of silence, "that wealth means very little if it buys your comfort at the expense of another's freedom." Elena looked up, surprised by the gravity in his voice. "My mother," he continued, "was a teacher and a stubborn one. She fought for the abolition of slavery long before it was popular, long before it was safe. She taught me that a man's worth is measured not by how much he owns, but by how fiercely he protects what is right." His words carried the weight of memory, not the boasting of privilege, but the inheritance of conviction. "And what about you, Miss Carter?" he asked, his gaze steady. "You speak like someone who has taught before." Elena hesitated. For a heartbeat, the truth rose in her throat, the school in Boston, the letters, the inheritance she carried in secret. But caution, born of survival, pressed it back down. "I was a teacher," she said softly. "Literature and history, at a girls' school." His eyes warmed. "History," he repeated. "That explains the way you look at the world as though you've read it cover to cover." She smiled faintly, lowering her gaze. "Some stories are worth revisiting. Others, you wish you could rewrite." A pause lingered between them, filled only by the gentle clink of silverware. Outside, a breeze brushed against the windows, stirring the curtains like a whisper of secrets yet to come. William didn't press further, and for that, she was grateful. But as she sat in the glow of candlelight, listening to the faint creak of the old house settling around her, she couldn't ignore the feeling that her silence was more than protection. It was the beginning of something larger. Because sometimes silence itself holds the kind of secret that can shake an entire town to its core. Morning broke over Hawthorne Hall with a pale, forgiving light. By mid-afternoon, the sun angled low, slipping through high windows of the library and laying warm bars across the floor. Dust drifted in slow constellations. The room smelled of lemon oil and old glue, of leather that had absorbed a century of secrets. Shelves climbed to the ceiling, crowded with atlases, bound ledgers, county registers, and family Bibles that seemed to hum with unspoken names. It was the kind of room where history did not sit still. It breathed. Elena eased the ladder along a brass rail and climbed, her fingers tracing the ridges of spines as if reading them by touch. The first book she pulled free released a soft sigh, pages loosening after years of silence. Paper rasped under her hands. Somewhere, a clock ticked with the steady patience of a witness. She set a broad portfolio on the table and untied the faded ribbon. Inside lay a series of plats and surveys, ink browned at the edges, the vellum translucent where it had been handled often and hard. She flattened the largest sheet with her palms. A river curved in a confident line. Parcels sprouted along its banks like careful stitches. Someone had penciled numbers where names should have been. She leaned closer. The erasures were not clumsy. They were deliberate. Names rubbed away and written over with new owners in a firmer hand. On the back of the sheet, a different story survived. In the ghosted impression where ink had once pressed through, a surname rose when she tilted the paper into the light. The F was sharp, the R looped, the E and E narrow twins, Freeman. Her heartbeat lifted, then steadied. She turned to a drawer of county registers and drew out a volume bound in cracked burgundy. The ledger opened with a creak, the paper thin as leaves. Years marched down the columns, neat and impartial. Sales, transfers, forfeits. She followed the dates like stepping stones across a stream and found a gap where there should have been continuity. The clerk's pen trailed off in late summer, then returned months later with a new owner, a new price, and no explanation. Between those entries, a note had been sliced so close to the stitching that only a fringe of parchment remained. She did not swear. She did not sigh. She moved to a second ledger, then a third, building a scaffolding of facts where the records had been hollowed out. On a lower shelf, she discovered a narrow box mislabeled miscellaneous receipts. Inside, under faded seed invoices and a bill for fence posts, lay a folded map that did not belong with the others. It was not a surveyor's work. The lines were careful but informal, the ink a softer brown. In the corner, someone had written, not in a clerk's tidy hand, but in a personal one, Hawthorne Valley Holdings, 1,871, Consolidation Plan. The parcels were numbered to correspond with the land around Willow Ridge. Several numbers had tiny crosses beside them. In the key, written even smaller, the crosses stood for contested claims. She carried the map to the window and let the sun find it. Again, the erased names rose like watermarks, faint but stubborn. Freeman appeared more than once. In the margin, a name had been struck and rewritten, Isaiah Freeman. Then another hand had added a note with a colder certainty, disposition pending. She mouthed the words without sound. The clock ticked on. From the far doorway, William paused. He had come to ask a question about supper and found her bent over the table, sleeves pushed to her elbows, hair sliding loose at the nape of her neck, surrounded by an expanding galaxy of documents. He did not interrupt. He watched the way she narrowed her eyes to parse a clerk's flourish, the way she tested angles of light to revive what others had tried to kill. Intelligence, he thought, is not volume, it is focus. Elena moved again, cross-referencing the contested parcels with a stack of tax rolls. Some years were complete, others suffered sudden omissions that lined up too neatly with her map's crosses. She penciled a timeline on a scrap of paper. A school teacher's order returned to her hands, efficient and spare. In the margins, she listed names of families that still held land along the river and the years they first appeared in the books. When she stepped back, the pattern no longer needed her to explain it. The years of transfer clustered around the same season. The witnesses repeated. A notary's signature reappeared with suspicious frequency, and behind those signatures a shadow formed. Committee meetings recorded as church gatherings, community auctions advertised as charitable corrections, a rewriting of ownership disguised as civic duty. She went to the Atlas case and lifted a heavy county volume. Inside, a lithograph of Willow Ridge spread across 2 pages, all clean lines and civic pride. She touched a fingertip to the square where the mercantile now stood. then to the slope that led to the hawthorn fields, then to the lowland that flooded each spring and somehow never changed hands. She felt, rather than heard, the hum of a story threading itself back together. The names that had been removed from the ledgers had not vanished. They had migrated to the margins of other lives, waiting for someone stubborn enough to collect them. William finally spoke, his voice low so as not to startle the delicate progress of her work. "What are you seeing?" She did not look up right away. She used the side of her hand to rub a faint pencil mark where a clerk had attempted to align the false date with the correct column. Then she answered, "Gaps that behave like intentions, a hand that repeats where it should not, and a surname that refuses to disappear even when it's been erased. Freeman." He said it as a statement, not a guess. She nodded. "Isaiah Freeman. If I can connect the contested parcels to the erased names, if I can find an original deed or a gubernatorial grant, then the story changes from rumor to record. People respect what is written down more than what is true, but sometimes you need both to wake a town." He folded his arms, not in skepticism, but in a measured respect. "Do you need help?" She shook her head, then reconsidered. "Access. If there are family trunks, old correspondence, anything from the years after the war that your father or grandfather set aside, not in the formal drawers, but where men put what they are not ready to destroy, attics, cellars, the back of a desk." He almost smiled. "Mrs. Collins keeps the keys to rooms I forget we own. I will ask her." His gaze returned to the table. "You make order out of smoke, Miss Carter." She allowed herself the smallest answer. "No, I find the fire that made it." As evening slid toward dusk, she layered documents in a careful sequence. Map to ledger, ledger to tax roll to personal letter salvaged from a binding of scrap. The library altered around her. It was no longer a room of books. It was a courtroom waiting for proof. Every page carried a weight, every erasure a confession, and inside her chest, something steady and fierce took root. Not anger alone, not grief alone, purpose. William watched that purpose reveal itself, the way dawn reveals a landscape, slow and then all at once. He had seen men negotiate deals with spreadsheets and contracts. He had rarely seen anyone lift a town's history with nothing more than patience and light. Elena capped her pencil and placed the eroded map on top of the pile, aligning the corners as if tucking in a child. She glanced toward the windows where the day had grown thin. Tomorrow, she would climb higher on the ladder. She would open the boxes whose labels lied. She would press the past against the sun until it yielded its names. Because in a place like Willow Ridge, where power had grown comfortable and memory had been taught to forget, truth would not shout. It would whisper through paper and dust, and then, with the right hands, it would thunder. The knock came mid-afternoon, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the quiet halls of Hawthorne Hall. Mrs. Collins appeared in the doorway of the library, her usual calm touched by unease. "Mr. Green is here to see you, Miss Carter," she said carefully, as though even speaking his name might sour the air. Elena looked up from her notes, the ink still wet on the page. For a moment, she said nothing. The name carried a chill, a reminder of a train platform, of whispers, of humiliation disguised as politeness. But that woman, the one who trembled under the weight of other people's stares, no longer existed. When Thomas Green stepped inside, hat clutched tight in both hands, his eyes darted between her and the towering shelves behind her. He looked smaller somehow, swallowed by the richness of the room, the soft light, the scent of polished wood, the quiet that spoke of intellect and command. "Elena," he began, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. "Miss Carter, I should say, I came to see how you were adjusting. This must all be a bit overwhelming. I only wish to make sure you were alive," she interrupted gently. "I assure you, Mr. Green, I am very much that." His face flushed. "You misunderstand me. I only thought, given how things ended between us, that perhaps—" "How things ended?" Her voice was calm, but her gaze sharp enough to cut through his excuses. "You mean the part where you offered to pay for my absence? Or the part where you turned my humanity into a liability?" He shifted his weight, his fingers worrying the brim of his hat. "You must understand, Elena, a man in my position." She rose slowly from her seat. The movement was small, but it changed the air between them. Gone was the timid traveler from the train station. The woman before him now carried herself with quiet authority, her back straight, her voice steady, her presence commanding. "I do understand, Mr. Green," she said softly. You're a man so terrified of losing reputation that you'd rather sacrifice your decency than face a rumor. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. Around them, the silence pressed in like judgment. Tell me, she continued, do people in Willow Ridge speak kindly of men who abandon their promises at the first hint of discomfort? Or do they whisper just the same? Thomas's face reddened. You think you're above all this now because you've found shelter in a rich man's house? A low voice answered from behind him. Careful, Thomas. He turned to find William Hawthorne standing in the doorway, arms folded, his expression unreadable. You forget whose house you're standing in. Thomas stiffened. I meant no offense, Mr. Hawthorne. I was simply reminding yourself that cowardice never dies easily. William's tone was calm, but the weight in it made Thomas falter. You threw away something you never took the time to understand. Now you walk into my library as though you have the right to question her place here. Thomas swallowed hard. You don't know what it's like in this town, Hawthorne. People watch. They talk. They've talked about me for years, William said, stepping closer. And yet, they still trade on my land, drink water from my wells, and send their sons to beg for my favor when harvest runs thin. Do you know why? Because reputation built on fear crumbles, but respect, real respect, is earned by standing firm when others hide. Elena watched the exchange in silence. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet recognition of balance restored. Thomas's lips parted, desperate for some final defense, but none came. His gaze flicked from William's calm authority to Elena's composed defiance, and in that reflection, he saw the truth of himself. Small, trembling, ordinary. He turned as though to leave, but paused at the door. You've changed, he muttered, almost to himself. No, Elena said, her voice low but unwavering. I've remembered who I was before you tried to make me forget. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look back. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed down the hall, each one fainter than the last. William waited until the silence settled again before speaking. You handled him well. Elena exhaled softly. He came expecting the woman from the station, the one who bowed her head. William's bowed purred, gaze met hers, and instead, he found the woman who stood taller than his pride. She smiled faintly. Perhaps that frightens him more than he'll ever admit. William nodded. A man who fears losing his reputation will trade his soul to keep the mask intact. But a woman who learns the power of her truth, that's something no man in Willow Ridge will ever forget. And as the last light of afternoon spilled across the polished floor, Elena returned to her work calm, composed, unshaken. The world had shifted once again, and this time, she was the axis it turned upon. Rain came sudden and hard the next afternoon, drumming on the slate roof of Hawthorne Hall, laying a restless rhythm under the work that consumed Elena. The library glowed in a stormlight, windows streaked, shadows moving like thoughts across the walls. Pages flared under her hands. Ink bled soft and sure. The world beyond the glass blurred into a smear of gray, but inside the room, everything sharpened. She moved with purpose. Opened the ledger, note the date, cross-check the witness, flip to the tax roll, pencil a margin mark, return to the map. Her breath kept time with the rain. The steady tick of the brass clock matched her heartbeat. Paper whispered as it turned. Old glue cracked in the spine, and every sound felt like a clue reporting for duty. By nightfall, a timeline had taken shape across the table, a hard line drawn through soft lies. The parcels along the river changed hands in a pattern too clean to be chance. The same notary, the same two witnesses, the same month, repeated like an echo. And there, threaded through the chain like a name that refused to die, the word that had risen the day before when sunlight revealed what erasers could not erase: Freeman. She dug into county grants, the ones older than any shop, sign, or fence post in Willow Ridge. A bound packet, misfiled under agricultural subsidies, broke free of its twine. Inside, a governor's seal pressed a wavering circle into paper gone brittle with years. The date was late summer, just after the war. The signature was formal, careful, confident. The grant conveyed a broad swath of the valley to Isaiah Freeman for service rendered and losses sustained. Streams described in precise degrees. Oaks and stones named as if they were living witnesses. She whispered those landmarks to herself, then traced them on the older map and watched the valley unlock. Storm deepened. Rain turned to a finer sound, like hands tapping on a drum. Elena's pencil raced. She drew lines between the grant and the later transfers. She wrote the names of families beside the parcels they had come to occupy. She circled the fall that followed the grant, the season of church bazaars, of committee meetings, of auctions labeled benevolent. She had seen this pattern before in history books, in towns that swore they were better than their past and yet had memorized its every move, a new file. The minutes of a civic committee, the ink proud of its own civility, language clean and noble. The phrase public interest appeared 3 times on a single page. Buried in the foot of a paragraph, a sentence noted that a member named Green had recused himself from a vote due to a family association he did not describe. The surname struck her like a small bell. She looked up, saw the storm reflected back at her in the window, and lowered her gaze with a sharper focus. Thomas Green, not the author of the theft, perhaps, but the heir to its comfort. The chain of deeds confirmed it. A general store first registered under his grandfather's name, cited on a lot where the grant had been clearest. The price, the witnesses, the neatness. Everything too tidy for an honest town. She rose to the top shelves again, the ladder rolling with a soft, metallic hush. A box labeled Congregational Reports wedged behind a stack of hymnals gave way with a reluctant scrape. Inside, under programs and donation lists, lay a folded, circular, unmailed. The language was careful, almost tender, a call to protect the valley's moral order during a time of unrest and rumor. At the bottom, River Committee on Property Correction, 3 signatures, the notary's mark again, and an addendum initialed in small, nervous letters. If resistance persists, proceed without announcement. Her hands went cold. She steadied herself against the ladder, then climbed down and set the circular beside the grant, the map, the ledgers, the tax rolls. The picture no longer felt like conjecture. It was a structure. It stood up on its own. William found her there, rainwater on his shoulders, the smell of the storm still clinging to his coat. He stopped at the threshold. The table looked like a battlefield and a blueprint at once. He said nothing. The only sound was the rain's hush and the faint metronome of the clock. She spoke first. I have it. He stepped closer, careful not to disturb the arrangement. Show me. She began at the beginning, voice low, precise, a teacher at her best. The grant to Isaiah Freeman, the survey lines, the landmarks that had not moved, the season of transfers, the committee's language, the notary's signature like a thumbprint left at every scene. The Green family arriving in the records at the exact moment the committee's work turned from theory to practice. She did not accuse. She did not need to. The facts accused for her. William listened without interruption, his focus narrowing to the cadence of her argument. When she finished, the rain had softened to a fine mist against the glass. He exhaled, not in shock, but in the acceptance of something he had suspected without proof for too long. What do you need to make this undeniable? Verification, she said. Certified copies from the State Archive, a historian to authenticate the grant and the surveys, a lawyer who knows the language of land so well that even a fearful town council cannot pretend to misunderstand. Done, he said, already turning toward the hall. I will send for Whitaker in the morning. He knows the records commission in the Capitol, and Judge Harlan will see the value in protecting the process as much as the truth. She nodded. And we will need to protect the documents themselves. No one must be allowed to claim they were misread or misplaced. He smiled, just briefly. Mrs. Collins keeps a safe that even I forget exists. Your work goes there tonight. They move quickly. Copies were made. Photographs taken with William's old camera. The tripod legs creaking. The bulb flashing like a captured piece of lightning. Mrs. Collins arrived with a ledger of keys and a seriousness that made her look like an officer sworn to a quiet war. Papers slid into folders, folders into the steel mouth of the safe. The door shut with a sound that felt like a vow. Days followed in a swift weave of scenes. A ride to town through roads still slick with rain, hooves throwing up dark fans of mud. A telegraph office where William's name turned clerks into messengers and messengers into disciples. Replies arrived, clipped and formal. The Records Commission would confirm. A state historian would travel. A legal mind from 3 counties over agreed to review, not for spectacle, but for integrity. At night, under lamplight, Elena wrote the narrative they would need, not a story, but a sequence, clean and spare. Statement of grant, chain of title, evidence of erasure, proof of consolidation, names linked to deeds, deeds linked to conduct. She sketched the map large enough for a room to see. She marked the parcels not with accusations, but with dates. Every choice purposeful, every sentence an arrow pointing to the only conclusion an honest person could reach. William watched her plan form its own momentum. He supplied what she asked for and nothing she did not. He made introductions and then stepped back, as if he knew a truth few men of wealth ever learn. Some power is best spent clearing a path and guarding the edges, while a better mind walks the center. On the morning the historian arrived, the sky lifted, washed clean by days of weather. The woman came with a portfolio and a professionalism that brooked no ceremony. She examined seals, inks, paper, binding. The soldierly posture of a clerk's hand. Her verdict was efficient and devastating, authentic, contemporary, unaltered where it mattered, altered where it damns. By dusk, the lawyer had drafted the language not of conquest but of correction. He would stand beside Elena, not in front of her. The hearing would be public. The records would be read aloud. The exhibits would be displayed. There would be no rumors, only receipts. Elena slept little that night, not from fear, from readiness. In the quiet hours, she heard the rain's memory in the gutters and the soft click of the clock marking time she no longer intended to surrender. She thought of Isaiah Freeman, a name that had learned to live in the margins until a patient hand coaxed it back to the center. She thought of a train platform and a handful of bills and the way shame tries to buy silence. When dawn came, the valley shone with a new clarity. The river moved with its usual confidence. The willows bowed as if greeting a procession that had not yet formed. In the library, she rolled the map and tied it with clean ribbon. She tucked the grant into a protective sleeve. She lifted the folder with the ledger copies, heavy and exact. William met her at the door, ready. She answered with a nod that felt like the hinge between two eras. And as they stepped out into the morning, the voice that had guided her through storms rose inside her, steady and sure. When knowledge becomes a weapon, justice never stays far behind. The town hall of Willow Ridge had never been so full. The great wooden doors groaned open, spilling light into a chamber thick with whispers and judgment. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by slivers of sunlight that cut through the high windows. Every pew creaked beneath the weight of townsfolk, merchants, farmers, wives in stiff collars, all drawn by the promise of scandal. They had come to witness what they believed would be the final humiliation of Elena Carter. At the front, Thomas Green stood beside the council table, his face pale but his voice loud, the desperate bravado of a man cornered. "She's been deceiving this town," he declared, his words snapping through the still air. "A stranger, a troublemaker, a woman stirring discord among decent people? I demand her removal from Willow Ridge before this farce goes any further." Murmurs rippled through the room. A few nodded, more simply watched, waiting the way people do when they sense a reckoning approaching. Then the doors swung open again. The crowd fell silent as William Hawthorne entered, tall and composed, the sound of his boots on the marble floor deliberate and steady. Behind him, Elena walked with measured grace, her dark dress simple but immaculate, her chin lifted just enough to meet the gazes that sought to pierce her. She carried a leather case under one arm, the faintest tremor of papers inside, catching the light. The hush was absolute. Judge Harlan adjusted his spectacles, his voice gruff. "Mr. Green, you will hold your tongue until these proceedings begin. Miss Carter, Mr. Hawthorne, you may approach." Thomas sputtered. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "Silence," the judge said, not raising his voice but slicing cleanly through Thomas's protest. William gave a small nod of respect to the bench. "Your Honor, we have evidence that concerns not only this woman's right to remain in Willow Ridge, but the foundation upon which much of this town was built." A collective gasp stirred the hall. Elena placed the leather case upon the table and opened it. One by one, she removed the documents, each unfolded with the same care a priest might give to sacred scripture. Maps, deeds, government grants, all aged and delicate, yet unmistakably authentic. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the room. "Miss Carter," Judge Harlan said carefully, "explain what we're looking at." She stepped forward, her voice steady but carrying a force that drew every ear. "This," she began, laying her hand upon the largest sheet, "is the original land grant signed by the state governor in 1866. It awarded ownership of nearly 60% of what you now call Willow Ridge to one man, my great-grandfather, Isaiah Freeman. He was a freedman, granted this land for his service and labor following the war." Gasps rose again, this time tinged with disbelief. Elena continued, her eyes sweeping the crowd. But in the years that followed, through a series of orchestrated transactions, that land was stolen, divided among a handful of founding families under the guise of community reorganization. Every signature, every seal in this record traces back to the same committee. And at its center, she paused, turning her gaze directly to Thomas, the Green family. Thomas's face drained of color. That's absurd. Lies. Forgeries. She's trying to extort this town. But William spoke before Elena could. The documents have already been authenticated by the State Historical Commission, he said calmly, and verified by the archives in the Capitol. Their word, Mr. Green, weighs more than your panic. The judge leaned forward, inspecting the seals through narrowed eyes. These are genuine, he murmured. I've seen enough state documents to know. A ripple of unease moved through the room. The proud whispers that had once condemned Elena now faltered, turning inward. Thomas staggered a step closer, desperation twisting his tone. You don't understand my grandfather. He didn't know. He bought that land fair, and fair? Elena's voice cut him off. Do you call it fair to profit from another man's silence? From erasing his name and his blood from the records? He shook his head, trembling now. I didn't do this. It wasn't me. No, she said, her expression unreadable. But you lived by the lie, and now the truth has found its way home. Judge Harlan turned to Thomas. These documents speak clearly. Your holdings and those of others were acquired through fraud. The court will recognize Isaiah Freeman's heirs as the rightful claimants. Thomas's legs buckled. He caught the edge of the table, his breath coming fast. Please, he whispered, voice breaking. You can't take everything. My family. Elena looked at him for a long moment. The crowd held its breath, waiting for vengeance, for the sharpness of retribution. But when she spoke, her tone carried neither cruelty nor triumph, only the weight of justice. I didn't come here to take back what was stolen, she said softly. I came to return what should never have been denied. Her eyes lifted, meeting the townsfolk, men and women who now looked at her not with pity, but with uneasy admiration. This land was meant to build, not divide, and I will see that it does. A long silence followed. Then, slowly, Judge Harlan stood. This hearing is adjourned, he declared, his gavel striking once, firm and final. As the crowd began to stir, whispers changed their tune. No longer cruel, no longer curious, but reverent. They had witnessed something they could neither deny nor diminish. Thomas Green sank into a chair, his face buried in trembling hands. The weight of his lineage pressed down on him, heavier than any fortune. William turned to Elena. You gave them truth, he said quietly, and you did it without hate. She exhaled, the faintest tremor leaving her shoulders. Because hate would have made me one of them, she replied. Justice needed more than anger. It needed clarity. As they walked from the hall, the murmur of the crowd followed a mixture of awe and reckoning. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long beams across the courthouse steps. And somewhere, in that fragile light, the story of Willow Ridge began to rewrite itself, not in whispers or ledgers, but in the unshakable voice of a woman who had come not to claim victory, but to restore truth. Seasons turned in Willow Ridge, and with them, the town itself began to breathe a different kind of air. What had once been whispered, shame now echoed as cautious hope. The dust that used to cling to the streets gave way to gardens and laughter. The silence of suspicion was slowly replaced by the hum of new beginnings. Where arguments once echoed in the hall of judgment, the sound of children now spilled into the square, running, chasing, shouting names that no longer carried the weight of old divisions. At the heart of this change stood the Freeman Foundation. What began as an act of restitution grew into a living promise. The old store that once bore Thomas Green's name became Willow Ridge's first public library, its shelves lined with books donated by families who had once turned their eyes away from truth. There, in the reading room, bathed in sunlight, young boys and girls discovered the stories of those who came before them, stories of courage, dignity, and reclamation. Beside the library rose a small schoolhouse, its bell ringing every morning across the valley. It was built not by decree, but by collective will, men and women who offered their time, their tools, their hands. In its classrooms, the Freeman Foundation funded scholarships for children who had once been told they didn't belong. Elena's vision had taken root, spreading beyond her reach, transforming land once tainted by greed into soil that nurtured every dream it had once buried. People spoke of her rarely in public, not out of fear, but out of reverence. In the market, when her name arose, heads would bow slightly, voices softening, as if speaking of a saint who had walked among them. They said she never sought praise, that she only wanted fairness to take root deep enough that it could not be uprooted again. Thomas Green's house, once the proudest on Main Street, stood empty for months before being sold. Rumor said he had left quietly, traveling north with little more than a single trunk. In a nearby town, he worked as a clerk, his name unremarkable, his presence unnoticed. Some pitied him, others did not. In the end, it mattered little. For a man who had lived by appearances, obscurity was the final judgment. Meanwhile, at the top of the hill, the Hawthorne estate changed too. The white manor that had once been William's inheritance became something larger, a haven for learning, a meeting place for those who wished to bridge divides rather than deepen them. People began calling it the Freeman Hawthorne House, though no sign declared it so. In the midst of quiet transformation, Elena and William wed not in fanfare or ceremony, but in a small gathering beneath the willows overlooking the valley. The vows were simple. No witnesses save the wind, and Mrs. Collins, who stood a few paces behind with tears in her eyes. It was not a union of convenience, nor a tale of rescue, but a joining of two souls who had seen the worst of the world and chosen to build something better in its place. When asked once why she never left Willow Ridge after all that had happened, Elena only smiled. "Because justice isn't revenge," she said. "It's restoration, and restoration can't be done from a distance." Her words lingered long after, becoming part of the town's vocabulary, a quiet truth repeated in classrooms, in sermons, in homes where parents reminded their children that fairness is not a gift, but a duty. One autumn afternoon, the townsfolk gathered in the central square. The sun slanted low, gilding every leaf in shades of copper and gold. At the center stood a modest bronze plaque mounted on a block of stone. Upon it were etched the words, "In honor of Isaiah Freeman, whose land, once taken, now serves all. May this town remember that dignity delayed is not dignity denied." Elena stood beside William as the crowd fell silent. For a long time, no one spoke. The air was still, save for the rustle of trees and the distant call of a train, a sound that once meant departure, now signaling connection. Children placed flowers at the base of the monument. An elderly man bowed his head, and somewhere in the hush of that moment, Willow Ridge, a town once built on erasure, finally learned to remember. As the sun dipped beyond the horizon, casting long shadows that reached across the square, Elena felt William's hand slip into hers. The warmth was steady, grounding, real. She closed her eyes for a moment and breathed in the life around her, the laughter, the pages turning in the library, the soft footfalls of a community reborn. She had come to Willow Ridge a stranger, defined by others' prejudices. Now she stood as its conscience, not by power, but by perseverance. And as dusk settled over the valley, her voice calm, sure, eternal seemed to echo across the fields, carried by the wind like a benediction. Justice was never about reclaiming what was lost. It was about giving back what was stolen, not just land, but hope. That night, the moon hung low over Willow Ridge, casting silver light across the rooftops and winding streets below. From the balcony of Hawthorne Hall, Elena stood in quiet reflection, her gaze drifting toward the distant train station, the same place where her journey had begun and nearly ended. She could still hear the echo of that day, the sting of rejection, the murmur of strangers, the hollow weight of humiliation. But time had transformed that wound into something greater, a reminder that even the cruelest moments can become the soil from which dignity grows. Below, the town that had once turned its back now glowed with life. The library's lanterns burned late into the night, windows spilling warm light onto the cobblestone square. The laughter of children floated upward, soft and pure, a melody untouched by prejudice. The name Freeman, once erased from every deed and record, now adorned the schoolhouse, the foundation, and the plaque in the square. It no longer belonged to one family, but to every soul who had learned to look beyond the color of another's skin. Elena closed her eyes and let the night breeze brush against her face. She was no longer the woman standing alone on a platform. She was something larger, a voice that had spoken truth into a place that had forgotten how to listen. People respected her now, not for the battles she won, but for the grace with which she chose to fight them. Not for her heritage, but for her heart. Behind her, William stepped quietly into the moonlight, his presence steady as always. He looked out over the town, the same town that had once doubted him for standing beside her. "Strange, isn't it?" he said softly. "How a place can change when it decides to see, instead of just look." Elena smiled faintly. Change takes courage, and courage begins when one person refuses to accept that cruelty is inevitable. William's hand brushed hers. "You've taught me something," he said. "Power can move mountains, but forgiveness can move people, and that's where real strength lives." She turned to face him, her voice a whisper carried on the wind. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past," she said. "It redeems it." For a moment, neither spoke. The town below shimmered, bathed in silver and promise. In that silence, the story of Willow Ridge became more than one woman's triumph. It became a testament to what can happen when truth is given a voice and compassion is given a chance. Because when we dare to confront prejudice, when we choose to believe in justice over vengeance, we don't just rewrite our own story, we reshape the future for every generation that follows. Elena looked once more toward the station, where the moonlight traced the empty tracks. They no longer represented escape, but arrival, the journey home to one's truest self. She took William's hand, and together they turned back toward the light. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on what it means to you. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let others know that stories like this still matter. And if you believe that dignity and justice are timeless, that they are the true measure of humanity, then like this video and subscribe to our channel. Because every view, every voice, is a reminder that compassion is not weakness, that truth is never outdated, and that the light we kindle in one small town can illuminate an entire world.